Chief Inspector's son received a harsh lesson after arguing in court. "I don't see what the big deal is," he muttered under his breath, shoulders squared, shoes clicking against the polished floor as he entered. Heads turned, whispers flitting like restless shadows across the courtroom. The son of the chief inspector, impeccably dressed, hair combed just so, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He gave casual nods to those who knew him, the kind of nods that carried both recognition and an unspoken, "I'm untouchable." Everyone noticed it, every glance, every flick of his wrist, every impatient tap of his foot. It all screamed confidence born from entitlement, a conviction that his father's reputation would shield him from any consequence. The judge's gaze held him, silent but unwavering, measuring, weighing. The room seemed to shrink around him, yet he didn't notice. He was scanning the courtroom as though he owned it, eyes darting over familiar faces, dismissing them with subtle gestures. Even the bailiffs, trained to maintain composure, felt the tension in the air. Whispers traveled from bench to bench, some skeptical, some irritated, all waiting for the inevitable slip that would reveal whether privilege or accountability would prevail. He leaned slightly against the edge of the defendant's table, still smirking, still unshaken, as if the evidence, the law, the victims, none of it could touch him. But in the silence of the courtroom, in the measured, unwavering stare of the judge, a single truth hovered unspoken. Arrogance might fill a room, but it could not fill the scales of justice. And as he adjusted his cufflinks, casual and careless, no one yet knew that the battle ahead would not bow to a name, a title, or a lineage. The first crack had yet to form in his armor, but the weight of it was already gathering. "You think a little chaos doesn't leave scars?" one of the victims said, voice trembling but firm, as the room held its breath. The young man shifted in his chair, glancing at the documents piled neatly before the judge. The photos of the aftermath spread across the table like silent witnesses. His earlier confidence faltered slightly as he saw the faces of those affected. Not just bruises and broken bones, but shattered routines, disrupted lives, the ripple of recklessness that no amount of lineage could undo. The testimony came in fragments, each word cutting deeper. A witness described the sound of screeching tires, the sudden collision, the helpless cries that followed. Another recounted the panic, the medical bills, the months of recovery that no apology could accelerate. And yet he leaned forward, interrupting, voice sharp. "It wasn't that bad. People are overreacting." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, eyebrows raised, pens paused mid-note, and a hush fell as the judge's eyes narrowed, assessing the audacity of the claim. Every document, every photograph contradicted him, yet he pressed on, arguing semantics over responsibility, discounting facts, as if proof could be silenced by sheer insistence. The judge finally spoke, voice calm, unwavering. "The facts speak for themselves. It is not a matter of perception." The words landed like a weight, but he smirked, stubborn, convinced that status could bend truth. The tension became almost tangible. Witnesses shifted in their seats, sensing the fragile barrier between entitlement and accountability was about to shatter. The young man's interruptions grew sharper, bordering on defiance. "Are you even listening to me?" he snapped. The courtroom reacted, whispers, raised eyebrows, the subtle tightening of shoulders. But the judge remained unmoved, a pillar of composure in a storm of arrogance. By the end of the exchange, the contrast was stark. The victim's pain laid bare, the evidence undeniable, and yet his sense of impunity persisted. It was a reckless dance, a dangerous gamble against justice itself. And in that moment, everyone in the room realized this was no ordinary trial. It was a test of moral authority, a confrontation between inherited privilege and the inescapable weight of truth. The first cracks of his overconfidence had begun to show, and the courtroom waited for the inevitable collapse. "Are we really going to sit here and take this seriously?" he said, voice low but sharp, the edge in it carrying a mixture of boredom and defiance. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood, as if the very walls of the courtroom were inconveniencing him. Every word, every glance, suggested that rules were for everyone else. His contempt was subtle, woven between polite interruptions and carefully measured sighs, but everyone could feel it, an invisible weight pressing against the decorum of the room. The judge's eyes met his, calm, unwavering. "This is not a matter of opinion," the judge said evenly. "It is a matter of fact, evidence, and responsibility." The young man smirked, a tilt of the head, a question implied. "And whose authority is that? Whose rules are we following?" The tension in the room shifted, a current running through the spectators and staff alike, the kind that signals that power is being tested, boundaries pushed, and consequences ignored. He questioned witnesses with a careful blend of faux curiosity and veiled challenge. "Are you sure you saw that correctly?" he asked one, voice almost conversational but loaded with insinuation. "I find it hard to believe this was as serious as you describe." A clerk scribbled quietly, noting the unease spreading through the room, a ripple that betrayed the growing strain of decorum under attack. Each sarcastic remark, each haughty gesture, widened the gap between his inherited sense of entitlement and the deliberate, disciplined authority of the judge. The judge responded with measured patience, refusing to be rattled, to bend, to let privilege rewrite. Accountability. "Your assertions are noted," the judge said. "They do not alter the evidence." Each reply was precise, unyielding, reinforcing the idea that no lineage or familiarity could shield reckless behavior from scrutiny. Frustration began to seep into the young man's expression. Subtle at first, a twitch of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, but unmistakable. He had underestimated the courtroom, underestimated the weight of moral authority that did not bend to name or status. The spectators felt it too, the first cracks in his armor, the moment when arrogance meets immovable principle. And yet, even in frustration, he remained defiant. Every glance, every small movement suggested a man still believing he could control the narrative, even as the threads of truth began to tighten around him. By the end of the session, his glare was sharp, unblinking, a silent promise of resistance. But beneath it, the faintest tremor of awareness. The evidence he had dismissed so lightly was already laying the foundation for a reckoning he could not argue his way out of. "She hit the ground before I even realized what had happened," a witness said, voice breaking as the memory spilled out. The courtroom was silent, taut with anticipation as the screen flickered to life. Surveillance footage filled the room, a reckless turn, a collision, a moment of chaos frozen in time. The young man's smirk wavered, a flicker of unease crossing his features as he watched the sequence play over and over, each frame unraveling the narrative he had tried so desperately to control. Photographs followed, images of injuries, damaged property, and the stunned faces of those caught in the aftermath. An expert stepped forward, analyzing impact reports and medical records with precise detail. The technical clarity left no room for interpretation. Each fact, each figure, pierced the veil of entitlement he had wrapped around himself. He leaned back, arms crossed, but the confidence that had carried him through the first confrontations faltered under the weight of undeniable proof. Witness after witness recounted what the documents could not convey: the panic, the helplessness, the weeks of recovery, the lives altered in moments of reckless disregard. He attempted to speak, to redirect blame, to cast doubt, but the words faltered, empty against the tide of corroborated reality. "You're exaggerating," he interjected weakly. But even in his voice, the cracks were audible. The judge's eyes locked on him, unwavering, a silent reminder that facts cannot be argued away by arrogance. The courtroom felt electric with moral tension. Every spectator sensed the turning point. Entitlement colliding with accountability, arrogance meeting a barrier it could not bypass. His gaze darted nervously, a flicker of panic beneath the practiced calm. Each piece of evidence, meticulously compiled and presented, chipped away at the illusion he had built. By the end of the session, a heavy silence settled. No smirks, no dismissive gestures, only the weight of realization pressing down. The young man had begun to see the extent of the consequences, not as abstract numbers or cold documents, but as real, living pain inflicted by his own recklessness. The anticipation hung in the air like a held breath. The reckoning was approaching, inevitable and unavoidable, and he could no longer shield himself behind a name or a reputation. Do you truly believe rules do not apply to you? The judge asked, voice steady, but cutting through the room like a scalpel. The question hung in the air, heavier than any evidence, heavier than any testimony. The young man's confident posture wavered for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, searching for words that could hold up against the weight of scrutiny he had never faced before. The inquiry went beyond the reckless incident itself. The judge delved into mentors who had looked the other way, colleagues who had silently condoned misbehavior, and the father whose reputation had shielded him from consequences in the past. Each revelation peeled back the layers of privilege that had insulated him from accountability. Each example, each testimony, exposed a pattern. Arrogance masked as confidence, entitlement disguised as cleverness, a history of bending rules because the rules themselves seemed optional when one carried the right name. He stammered, voice faltering. I didn't mean... The words died mid-sentence, inadequate, fragile under the moral weight pressing down. Observers exchanged glances, murmurs threading through the room. For the first time, the carefully curated image he had carried, the untouchable son of authority, began to crumble. His hands trembled slightly on the table. He swallowed hard, eyes darting as the judge continued, calmly, deliberately, peeling away excuses and defenses with surgical precision. The room was taut with tension. Witnesses, attorneys, staff, and even the public could feel the collapse of his shield of privilege. Whispers of accountability and moral reckoning rippled quietly, under the surface yet impossible to ignore. He had relied on lineage, on influence, on the unspoken rule that his father's name would shield him. But now, the illusion had shattered. By the end of the exchange, he sat visibly shaken. No smirk, no composure. Only a tense awareness that the moral confrontation had reached its peak. The courtroom, though silent, felt alive with the understanding that privilege could not protect reckless arrogance from truth. And in that moment, he began to grasp what so many had known all along. Power and name could open doors, but they could not open the conscience, nor could they erase the consequences of one's actions. Do you understand the consequences of your choices? The judge asked, voice steady, eyes unwavering, cutting through the residual tension that had filled the room for days. The young man shifted uneasily, finally stripped of the armor of privilege he had worn so confidently. The courtroom waited, a collective breath held, as the verdict began to take shape. Not merely a statement of law, but a measure of moral accountability. The ruling was precise and unflinching. Financial restitution to cover damages and medical costs was imposed, a tangible acknowledgement that actions have consequences. Public accountability measures were mandated, apologies recorded, community service documented, actions visible to those affected by his recklessness. And for the symbolic weight of the moral lesson, a formal reprimand would be filed, marking a permanent acknowledgement that arrogance and privilege cannot supersede responsibility. The young man's face registered disbelief, shock, humiliation, a cocktail of emotions that no inherited reputation could dilute. For the first time, he confronted the full extent of his actions and the impossibility of evading justice. His eyes darted from the judge to the witnesses, to the victims whose lives he had disrupted, and finally to his own hands, empty now of excuses, empty of defenses, empty of the imagined immunity he had once assumed. The courtroom absorbed the weight of the verdict. Witnesses, staff, and public observers felt the resonance of justice delivered, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a lived, undeniable reality. It was a statement that names, connections, and titles hold no power when measured against the principles of accountability. The young man sat in silence, the magnitude of the lesson sinking in, a stark contrast to the stoic satisfaction of those who had fought to see truth recognized. Justice in this moment was more than legal procedure. It was moral clarity made manifest, a demonstration that reckless behavior, no matter the origin, carries consequences that must be met. And as the courtroom slowly exhaled, a quiet reflection lingered. Responsibility is not inherited, it is claimed. And when it is abandoned, the reckoning is unavoidable. The lesson would remain long after the gavel fell, a reminder etched into memory, A stark truth, no smirk, no influence, no father's name could erase. A camera flash caught him off guard as he stepped out of the courthouse, the buzz of reporters filling the air with questions he could no longer evade. Headlines already framed the story. Chief Inspector's son held accountable, and arrogance meets justice. The weight of the verdict pressed against him far beyond the courtroom walls. Each photograph, each recorded comment, each whispered conversation in the crowded streets reminded him that privilege could not erase consequences. Family tensions simmered beneath the surface. His father's pride, once an invisible shield, now felt like a pressure point, a reminder that reputation offered no immunity when moral responsibility was ignored. Conversations with relatives were clipped, awkward, laced with unspoken disappointment. Friends once deferential kept their distance. Even casual acquaintances exchanged wary glances, a silent acknowledgement that the arrogance that had carried him this far was no longer a currency he could trade on. Public validation of the judge's decision unfolded in real time. Social media posts, commentaries, and community discussions echoed the same lesson. Entitlement does not outweigh accountability. People who had once assumed he was untouchable now saw clearly the consequences of reckless behavior and the inevitability of justice. Each reaction, each opinion, reinforced a principle that had become painfully concrete. No amount of lineage or influence could shield one from the consequences of actions. He walked alone, the city around him indifferent yet sharply aware of his fall. The lesson was personal, harsh, unyielding. Responsibility, he realized, was not something inherited. It was claimed, maintained, and honored, or it would be demanded of you with consequences you could not avoid. And in the solitude of reflection, he began to understand what the courtroom had demonstrated so definitively. Arrogance, unchecked privilege, and disregard for others carry costs that no apology, no smirk, no name can erase. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the streets, he paused, the weight of accountability pressing him to a rare stillness. He could no longer lean on status or influence. The world had recalibrated the scales of justice, and the lesson, bitter, unavoidable, morally absolute, would stay with him, a reminder that power is fleeting, but responsibility endures.